Our speaker tonight is Dr. Matthew Spalding. Matthew Spalding is a Kirby Professor in Constitutional Government at Hillsdale College and the Dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College, Washington, D.C. campus. As a Vice President for Washington Operations, he also oversees the Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship and the academic and educational programs of Hillsdale and the nation's capital. He also serves as a trustee on our board here at New College of Florida. Please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Matthew Spalding. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. It's great to be with you. Before dawn on June 23rd, 1775, a rather large crowd had already gathered on the cobblestones of Chestnut Street outside the Pennsylvania State House. The first troop of the Philadelphia Light Horse, a cavalry unit armed, was there ready, as were all the uniformed members of the militia of Philadelphia. All eyes at that precise moment were on one man. Large presence, impeccably dressed in a blue and buff uniform. As one who was there wrote later in a letter, he appeared exactly as you would wish him to be. Tall, noble. Just a few days ago, on June 20th, George Washington had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. That morning, he was accompanied by Charles Lee, a British-trained, but now an American general, and also Philip Schuyler, another American general. Also with him was Thomas Mifflin, his first aide-de-camp, and Joseph Reed, his first military secretary. They were mounting to go on a 300-mile trip to Boston. John Adams that night wrote his wife Abigail, "Such is the pride and pomp of war." 2 months prior to this, shots had been fired at Lexington and then at Concord Bridge. Literally as Washington was leaving that morning in the pre-dawn hours, the first words had reached him that there had been some sort of conflict and perhaps a battle in Boston at a place called Bunker Hill. The British colonies of North America were going to war with the largest and strongest military power in the world. Most of Congress was there that morning. The dominant figures were still John Adams of Massachusetts and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. But there were also some new members present. John Hancock and Sam Adams had both just arrived, having evaded capture at Lexington. So also was a new member, Benjamin Franklin, who had left England just before his arrest. And James Wilson, the brilliant legal mind, probably the most brilliant of the day. But in the back of the crowd, there was another, indeed the newest delegate. He had just arrived, a late arrival, halfway into the session. He was an alternate, only having his place because Peyton Randolph had been called back to the Virginia legislature. A tall, lanky redhead, only 33 years old. 1 year hence, Thomas Jefferson would write, draft, the greatest statement of human liberty ever written. Tonight I want to talk about two things which may seem to be two different topics, but I'm going to try to intertwine them. George Washington, and the Declaration of Independence. We are approaching Washington's birthday. It's important for us to understand that there would be no Declaration of Independence without Washington. Indeed, in one of his great letters, Thomas Jefferson later, who would become a political enemy of the Federalists, you might recall, in his battles with John Adams, nevertheless wrote a letter after Washington's death, in which he says that of those men that I have known, Washington was by far the greatest. Indeed, no man ever deserved to be called great next to Washington. This is not the George Washington of Mount Rushmore. This is the George Washington and what he did and did not do. Washington, you see, is the bridge between the war and what we have today, a constitutional republic. He was a delegate from Virginia, so he was one of them, and they made him general. There was really no question as to who it would be. He had the experience, he served on the military committees, and he actually showed up to the Continental Congress wearing a uniform to signal that he was deadly serious. After they made him general and sent him off to war, he determined largely on his own through the war, but also through the way the peace was established, to make sure the war concluded in a republic and not a military dictatorship. He became president of the convention that wrote the Constitution and the first president of the United States. His importance is beyond description. I'll give you but one example of an immediate effect he had on the Declaration of Independence. In May of 1776, Washington is in New York, awaiting a potential attack by the British. And in the middle of that preparation, about to go to war, Washington went to Philadelphia and spends 10 days there meeting secretly with the Continental Congress. Washington had gotten intelligence from one of his own spies. Indeed, that intelligence was actual documents that the spy sewn into his jacket to cross the ocean, and he brought them to Washington in camp. Washington then took them to Congress. Those documents were actual evidence in English and German that the King of England had contracted with mercenaries from the Prussian states, one in particular, Hesse-Kassel, hence they're called Hessians. As many as 40,000 were going to join a war against America. He went to Congress in May of 1776. What do you think he told them? We don't know because the sessions are secret. But at the time, he also wrote a letter to another delegate, indeed a delegate of Pennsylvania, who was meeting with the Pennsylvania legislature upstairs from the Continental Congress. This is what that letter said. I would not be deceived by artful declarations or specious pretenses, nor would I be amused by unmeaning propositions, but in open, undisguised, and manly terms proclaim our wrongs and our resolutions to be redressed. I would tell them that we had borne much, that we had long and ardently sought for reconciliation upon honorable terms that had been denied us, that all our attempts after peace had proved abortive and had been grossly misrepresented, that we had done everything that could be expressed from the best of subjects, that the spirit of freedom beat too high in us to submit to slavery, and that if nothing else would satisfy a tyrant in his diabolical ministry, we were determined to shake off all connections with a state so unjust and unnatural. This I would tell them, not under covert, but in words as clear as the sun in its meridian brightness. We don't know what he told the Congress, but I'm betting he told them we're going to war. George Washington, you see, we might call him the action figure of the American Revolution, or the Homeric hero, because the great epic poetry of America, or epic poetry, is the Declaration of Independence. I want to focus briefly on two events, July 2nd and July 4th. On July 2nd, Congress was going to meet, as perhaps we recall, for a final debate and a final vote on the cause of independence. But my story does not have to do with Philadelphia. Again, after Boston, the British had been forced out of Boston, Washington is in New York. You see, 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, Washington had already declared independence. But in New York, on the morning of July 2nd, before the Continental Congress met, his spotters were observing British vessels entering lower New York Harbor. 48 hours earlier, they had spotted masts on Sandy Hook outside. And on that morning, July 2nd, 100 vessels started moving troops through the straits and landing troops on Staten Island. The British attack on America, the invasion, if you will, that would occur in August of 1776 at New York, would involve 1/2 of the total British Navy. It was the largest seatime invasion yet in world history. And when they entered lower New York Harbor with their largest ships of war, with 60 cannons apiece in some cases, they were merely 4 nautical miles from Washington's location. The other event is on July 4th. We know that between July 2nd, when they voted for independence, and July 4th, they spent all that time debating the declaration that Jefferson had drafted. Jefferson's chosen to draft it by the committee, prominently made up of John Adams and Ben Franklin and Jefferson. And Adams famously told Jefferson, "You write it. Everyone else hates me." You're also a better writer. He had a reputation for good writing, and he's a brilliant, wonderful, beautiful writer. But that document is debated the whole time, finally passed on July 4th. Congress cuts it by about 1/3. Jefferson was not happy about that. And they made some very excellent edits and made it to a much better document, amazingly enough. A legislative document that was passed by the Continental Congress, which was a precursor to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, which was a precursor to the United States Congress. The Declaration of Independence is an organic document of the United States. Just to quickly mention 4 famous phrases in the document to give us a sense of what they were up to. The first line, of course, is "when in the course of human events." Interesting choice of words. It doesn't say when in the course of history. It doesn't give a particular date. But it does say when in the course of human events. History is not some overarching process over which we have no control. Do you ever hear a student say, "You're on the wrong side of history"? That's nonsense. The American founders' understanding of history was things that we shape by human decision. They also understood themselves to be shaped by the history before them. The Greeks and the Romans, the medievals, the Christian tradition. America is a beautiful country, according to the hymn, because of its spacious skies and amber waves of grain. But that same hymn also says it's beautiful because of its glory tale of liberating strife. America's history is a history of mistakes, but also great, and noble deeds. Second phrase, the one we all know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Again, we read these things a million times and don't think about them much. The founders' world assumed the human mind is capable of not knowing the truth of things. We are actually metaphysically free. Notice how they didn't say, "We have some personal opinions we'd like to share with you." There are certain truths that the mind can grasp, and certain of them are self-evident, meaning they're evident in the thing itself. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, government is instituted among men, based on consent. And when government is destructive of those rights, the people, as a corporate right, have the right to alter or abolish it and institute new. The very next sentence begins with the word prudence. Prudence will dictate, my third phrase. Interesting. Abstractions are difficult. Abstractions are one thing. All men are created equal. Knowing what to do in particular circumstances is very, very hard. The cardinal virtue of political life, according to the Greeks, according to the Romans, and according to the Christian tradition, all is prudence. It's the most classical word in the document. Washington, by far, was a prudent man. When to fight, when not to fight. When to retreat, when to counterattack. The question of prudence is, what is the principle you are pursuing? My fourth phrase is the last line of the Declaration. By all accounts, the most beautiful. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That line, one of the few, is in Jefferson's original draft and was untouched throughout the process. It is a beautiful line. But the word that makes that line electric is clearly a parallel with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But now it's our lives, our fortune. But the word that makes it electric is our sacred honor. You see, you can't dedicate to each other something you're pursuing, like happiness, as important as that is. But you can pledge your honor. And you can pledge, in this case, your sacred honor, something that is honorable before God. There are two individuals in the Declaration, only two. One, I don't want to spoil it for you, but one of them is George III, and he's a bad guy. But the other one, which we must not miss and ignore, is God. He appears 5 times in the Declaration. Laws of nature, and nature is God. He creates, all men are created equal, so there's a creator. That same creator endows us with our rights. Towards the end, the supreme judge of the world, who judges the rectitude of our intentions. And then divine providence, to whom we appeal for protection. Notice how it becomes more personal and intimate over the course of the document. there's something here that we sometimes ignore. It's not specifically denominational. It's not, this is not the New Testament. This is not formal revelation. But it's also not merely secular rationalism. There's a theology here that we can understand and see that they're appealing to. That's an important message in the Declaration. Abraham Lincoln gave a famous speech in July of 1858 in Chicago when he was beginning his campaign against Stephen Douglas, running for Senate. And it was near the 4th of July. He was speaking on July 10th. And towards the end of the speech, he calmed and quieted the crowd and asked for the indulgence and talked about those signers of that old document and how we all know that what we enjoy today, all of our successes, our flourishing, our economy, our strength, or our safety of our homes and our hearths and our families, has something to do, indeed, was because of what they did. And he says that in passing, they were iron men. George Walton, the 1st Georgia Regiment, one of the signers, he was hit by a musket ball at the Battle of Savannah and taken prisoner. Richard Stockton of New Jersey, he was captured and tortured. All of the delegates from New York were hunted. Francis Lewis, who had a home in what is today Queens, the British sent a cavalry there. He wasn't home, but his wife Elizabeth was. She refused to submit, and so a ship in Long Island Sound opened fire on the home until she did surrender, and she was imprisoned until George Washington forced a prisoner exchange. But she suffered because of her imprisonment and died very soon thereafter. Abraham Clark's 2 sons were both in the Continental Army. Both of his sons were captured, imprisoned, and tortured to try to force their father to recant the Declaration of Independence. He did not. The famous story of the signing of the Declaration, you will recall, John Hancock of the big signature. He said, "Gentlemen, we must all hang together and do this united." To which Franklin supposedly quipped, which is probably true because he was full of quips, "Yes, we must all hang together, or surely we will all hang separately." I wonder how much of a joke that was. When Washington was in Philadelphia, that I referred to earlier, in May of '76, when he was telling them that it was time to go to war, he also wrote a letter to his brother in which he said, "We must either conquer or submit, and that will result in hanging, etc., etc." And I've always wondered, what does etc., etc. mean? Because I'm betting he told that to the Continental Congress. And it turns out in 1776, the punishment for treason, and they had all been declared treasonous, was to be hanged, but then drawn and quartered. I will not go into details of what that means. They were all signing their own death warrant. The British tried to capture Washington on several occasions, and they had tried to assassinate him at least once. They were iron men. My question to you, and I'll end with this, what happens when they are all gone? When fathers no longer can tell their sons the stories? Or what about people like my family who immigrated from Ireland and don't have any ancestors that fought in the American Revolution? Abraham Lincoln gave the answer, and today is Lincoln's birthday. Abraham Lincoln gave the answer in that speech in Chicago. When they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation, which is, say, our relation to those men. That is the father of all moral principle in them, meaning us, and that they have a right to claim it, as though they were blood of the blood and the flesh of the flesh of those who wrote the Declaration. That, what Lincoln describes, he says, that is the electric cord that connects us. That's what makes America exceptional. That's what makes America worthy of our affection. We all have our own stories, but at some point we come to love our country. It's first instinctive when we're young, so our families and those around us, and perhaps an uncle or an ancestor, we're drawn into it. But then eventually, because of deep reflection about what it actually means, what it aspires to, it's imperfect because we're an imperfect people. But the principles of America, turns out, are worth dying for. So, I ask you this year especially, in 2026, the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, join me in falling in love with America again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spalding, for that marvelous talk. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Good. My name is Casey Wheatland. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at New College, Florida. And before we turn to questions from the audience, I would like to ask you, Dr. Spalding, a couple of questions myself pertaining to your new book, The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. And first, I want to turn us back to George Washington. In your book, you quote from Washington's first inaugural address, where he says, "There is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness." In light of this quotation, if we look then to the Declaration of Independence and this unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, how should we understand this? Is virtue a necessary part of that pursuit?
That's a good question. Very, turned on. It's a great question. I'm going to make a general point first. The title refers to the American mind. That's actually a line from Jefferson, who writes a letter in 1825, in which he's asked by Henry Lee, who's a historian who's going to write about his history, what were you doing in the Declaration of Independence? And Jefferson says, I wasn't there to invent new ideas and put new thoughts in the Declaration. I was there to state the common sense of the subject. The Declaration is meant to be an expression of the American mind, which is to say that he understood himself as the drafter of these ideas, which had been percolating around for years, and even decades, going back to earlier education and in the colonies, and debates about reason of revelation, sermons, and human nature, all of these things. So the reference to Washington understood this. He was a man of action. He was also deeply thoughtful, much more than I ever thought in these letters. Just didn't write a book. Which is why I thought when I was writing a dissertation on Washington, he'll be easier. But he deeply understood all of these things. And the connection between that quote about the connection of virtue and happiness and the Declaration is they both make reference to nature. And the tradition out of which the Declaration comes and the founders come, they were modern in the sense that they believed that religious toleration, limited government. The 1776 is also when Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, was a still have at least one foot in this older world, going back to the Greeks and Romans. They say Cicero, Quadrant. And the Christian tradition is very strong and dominant as their horizon. Also partakes in the same argument, especially Richard Hooker, a great Anglican thinker, who's himself a student of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. It's just amazing and intertwined. The narrative of nature is not that man has a nature, and that what we want to do is, in our politics, is design politics to allow for a flourishing of that nature. And we do this through limited government, so people can pursue happiness. But happiness doesn't mean whatever makes you feel good. It means doing those things which is the happiness of human happiness. It has something to do with what it means to be human. It doesn't determine everything. It's not one answer, one thing that fits all. But in the economy and course of nature, which is Washington's quote, there's a clear connection between virtue and happiness. Virtue and happiness. What are virtues? Circumstances, there's breadth here, but there's a connection between being virtuous, which is human excellence. It doesn't mean some sort of like namby-pamby, puritanical rule. Right? It means human flourishing, and excellence. There's a connection between living out that kind of a life, a good life, and being ultimately happy in the full substantive sense of happiness. So, sorry, long answer, but they're intimately connected, and I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, I've been teaching this for a long time, but so many of these arguments are they're generally forgotten, but also they've been kind of masked over in kind of our modern world. We don't think about these things anymore. But there's this powerful, beautiful argument in finding the Declaration. It's expressed so beautifully, but it really is this larger, longer thing we broadly call the Western tradition that Jefferson brilliantly tried to encapsulate and stuff.
And if I might note, in that letter from Thomas Jefferson, that is the source of the title of his book, he points to Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney as these four sources of what we call the elementary books of public right. And so there you see this broad Western tradition encapsulated in that document. Dr. Spalding, that was going to be a follow-up question. I think you already answered it. I'm going to move to...
I was trying to anticipate the question.
Yes. I will move to the next question. We have a number of teachers in the audience here of civics and American history. And when they go through the Declaration of Independence with their students, I find this myself, is that often students will, and general audience, general public, will often overlook the grievances. They'll look to the wonderful quotes that you quoted at the beginning and the end of the document, but not look at all the middle section. What can we learn from those grievances?
A lot, actually. Again, a general comment. We know the famous things, which are rightly famous and they're beautiful. And they were their essence of their essential ideas of America. But we have to understand, so Jefferson drafted a document. Adams was heavily involved in editing it. The committee then sent it to Congress. The Congress then spent 2 days editing it further. It was carefully crafted. And you got to look at it as two things. One is it's a symphony. It's this beautiful thing with different movements. But it's also a legal document. It's a legal court document. Right? There's an introduction. There's a statement of principle. There's an accusation. There's facts submitted. And there's a conclusion. This was their legal case against the king. And the power of that argument is always underscored by the fact that that's exactly what the British responded to. All of their response focused on the grievances. The other stuff was all nonsense. But the grievances were attacked on the person, the royal person. When you read the grievances, for instance, a whole bunch of them, they all begin, he has. It doesn't say, His Majesty has. It was a striking insult. But the grievances make up over a quarter of the document. They're very important. Probably the biggest piece of research was figuring out what they meant. There's no dates, there's no pattern, they're not in chronological order, and yet it's the most important part. But when you start seeing the pattern and start seeing and spending time thinking about what exactly is he talking about, it's excellent. The first part is about the abuses of the king. Remember, the Declaration is it's about abuses and usurpations. The first part is about the abuses of the king, the things the king did using his power that abused the Americans, denying their consent, putting troops to enforce, swarms of his officers to eat at our substance. That's the most colorful of the grievances. The second part is about usurpations, and by usurpations they meant what Parliament has done. And the Americans, you have to understand, recognized no authority in Parliament. Their relationship was just with the king by charter. So Parliament, nothing. But the king, after the Glorious Revolution, acted under Parliament, and so he was enforcing their laws, which is exactly what the British, they're like, what are you talking about? But from the American perspective, that was a usurpation of our power, because it took away our legislative rights of our own, so usurpations. And then the last section of the grievances is about the kings having made war upon our very humanity. Burning towns, impressing Americans to serve in the British Army, the British Navy, and probably most crucially, probably for most people who read it, the first time they learned this fact, that the king, it's the only grievance in the present as opposed to past, he at that very moment was sending mercenaries to come and kill us. So there's actually a pattern to them, very important. And I would actually say to a teacher, and this is not, you can teach all of the history of the American Revolution, including all of the history of the English Civil Wars, including up to the Glorious Revolution, by reading through the grievances. They're all sort of, Jefferson, everybody in 1776 would have known exactly what he's talking about. There's a passage in there that talks about the king has abdicated his power here. It's kind of an interesting turn of phrase. And it refers to Parliament's pretended legislation. Very specific term. Both of those phrases come specifically from Parliament's laws when they deposed James II and dethroned him. Why? Because of pretended legislation, and he had abdicated government here. So there's all these direct references if you see the pattern. And in 76, they would have known that. We don't know these things anymore because we don't know the history. But it actually is a great way to teach it. And it's all there. It's a complete document. And since I meant it's a symphony. It's all the parts are there.
We will now turn to...
I talked too long here.
No, that was an excellent answer. Very thorough. We will now turn to questions from the audience. And as we do, we're going to give priority first to our teachers, our Liberty Fellows in the audience, as well as to any students in the audience. And so we have fellows coming around with mics if anyone has a question. They are retrieving the mics.
They exited the room. How loudly can you speak? Okay, here we go. You pick people.
Right over here.
Hi, Trustee Spalding, Professor Spalding, Professor Wiedis, thank you. Very engaging talk. My name is Mike Sanderson, and I mentioned earlier how proud I am that I recently learned I'm a direct descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier. Yeah, and I'm immensely proud of that, but that doesn't change my perspective because I learned about the greatness of George Washington as a new college student in Intro to History with Professor Donachie in fall of '99. And my question is about the Fabian strategy, because we call it that after Fabius Maximus, and that's what I learned, like you put it with more parallel structure than I remember, when to fight, when not to fight, when to retreat, when to counterattack, and that's why he won, and without that, no American Republic. Also used in Russia against Napoleon. So we've heard a lot about classical education. To what extent did Washington or anyone else credit the Fabian strategy or study of like the war with Hannibal and whatnot with developing this Fabian strategy that was so successful, or anything else that brings to mind? Thank you.
No, thanks. Great question. So the Fabian strategy, correctly described here, is the strategy of Fabius, a Roman general, against Hannibal, who was invading. And what he did is he chose not to fight him and maneuver. And Washington does a lot of that. But what's interesting about Washington, in my opinion, is that he was not a doctrinal thinker, in the sense that, any war, the old saying, right? Any strategy, who's had anything to do with the military, any strategy, any war planning, the moment you step on the battlefield is out the door. So what's interesting about Washington is at the beginning of the war, he's actually extremely aggressive. They invade Canada. They send troops to Barbados to try to get a British fort there, which has a lot of gunpowder and guns. There's all sorts of things about his aggression. Then there's the long period where he's not aggressive, more Fabian, partially because he's about to be destroyed and overwhelmed at any moment. And they chase him all up New York and across New Jersey. But then there's another moment, which is his true brilliance in many ways. Congress is fleeing, right? Philadelphia is imminently potentially going to fall, and they flee, and their last act of legislation when they flee Philadelphia was to give Washington all power to make all decisions for the good of the Republic. Talk about a Roman, right? And what does Washington do with that power? He commands the collection of all ships, all boats. In December of 1776, he uses those boats to cross the Delaware. That is, he turns the battle around. And then he attacks at Trenton, which was unexpected. And then, even more brilliant, he goes back over the Delaware. The British are rushing to Trenton to figure out what the heck is going on. And he recrosses the Delaware at another point, and he attacks the British directly at Princeton. So I think the Fabian strategy is point well taken, and there's something to that, but it's insufficient. What I find amazing about Washington is he actually is a very good military strategist. One thing he realizes early on, surprise, surprise, is the importance of naval power. Right? A huge component of the British Navy is America, which means they can attack at will anywhere along the coastline. What does Washington figure out? We need a navy. We don't have one. France has a navy. The Battle of Yorktown is one of the most brilliant strategic maneuvers in world history. He secretly moves all of his troops from New York. They keep fires burning. They've got bakeries making French bread to fool the British. The French are there. He's sending out secret messages intended for the British to capture, to mislead them. And then he moves all of his army and Rochambeau's French army all the way from New York to Yorktown to capture Cornwallis. It's an absolutely brilliant move. Why? Because he realized the power of sea power. If we can get there before the British can, and if the French arrive at the precise moment to close off the Yorktown Peninsula, we will defeat an army. So he is a great strategist. But the brilliant thing about him is he's a military strategist, but military strategy by itself is insufficient. It demands grand strategy. And grand strategy is when military strategy serves a higher purpose, which in this case was to establish a constitutional republic. And that, throughout the whole time, is his objective. It's not about winning a battle or not. It's actually not about defeating the British in the field. That's not what's important. What's important is to remove the British from North America and build a country. And that country, unlike most of European countries in which the victorious military general takes over, no, this country will be a constitutional republic. Because I will assure that to be the case, because I'm going to control the end of the war, and I'm going to control then the writing of a constitution, and I'm going to be the first president. And I'm only going to serve 2 terms, and then I'm going to retire and go home. And think about it, that is unheard of in world history. That's Washington's legacy.
Question over here.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate all this. Well, to speak, I am also the son of a signer. My name's Robert Thomas Stone, if that means anything to you. But anyway, so I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the grievances in the list and Franklin in Paris. Can you talk about the Declaration itself on the world stage and how it was meant to garner support from foreign governments and to speak as a government to other governments about the...
Sure. One of the questions of the Declaration is who was the audience? And it's always assumed that the primary audience was these foreign governments. And I think they were very important. And we can actually, what's interesting, you can actually follow the spread of the Declaration as to when it's translated. But what's really interesting is we assume that the French court was the most important. But we know that the copy of the Declaration intended to go to Silas, I think is his first name, Dean, and the guy in Paris. The ship it's on is boarded by the British, and they throw it overboard. This I predict. I'm going to copyright this so that this will be the next Nicolas Cage movie. Somewhere on the bottom of the Atlantic, there is an original copy of the Declaration in a sealed naval case. Isn't that a great movie? But my point is, it didn't get to the French until later. It gets to Russia before it gets to Paris. And it's translated into Dutch, and there's different things. So that's important, the audience. But the most important audience for the Declaration actually is the domestic audience. And we know that because after they passed the Declaration, the very first thing they did is they ordered it to be printed immediately. And John Adams literally walked it 2 or 3 doors down to John Dunlop, an Irish immigrant, who printed that night copies called the Dunlop Broadsides. And they were to be sent immediately to every colony, every legislature, and especially to every general, and especially Washington, to be read in the field. So it does have an international meaning. It does have a very international tone to it. All men are created equal, not just Americans, all. But here's how we're doing it, right? But its unifying argument was meant to unify us as we literally are going into war, and unite us as a people. And the document plays really this overwhelming role, which it still does today, in my opinion, right? And in general opinion, right? It defines who we are at our highest. Lays the groundwork for the Constitution. The Constitution is meaningless without the Declaration.
But it also wanted us to take our place on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when in the course of human events is all of world history. And here you go. I mean, granted, we're in Florida. I'm from California. You don't see, but you come back to Washington to see right, all the architecture, the great architecture, not the bad architecture. There's a lot of bad architecture too. But all the great buildings are what? Classical. The model here was Greece and Rome. Indeed, what do Greece and Rome have in common that we don't have today? That Germany and France and other countries don't have. We call them founders. Germany was not founded. France was not founded. They grew up somehow in, the dark past. But Rome was founded. Athens was founded. Their model was that. And so they wanted to found a country. So they had very high international, worldwide intentions. But it's still true today. That means nothing unless we, the people, are somehow unified and having that self-understanding, which is why it's so important to understand their arguments and their principles.
In the second row over here.
No one questions Jefferson's incredible intelligence and understanding of European writings. But how much of his Declaration of Independence would be influenced by Common Sense by Thomas Paine? He's, comes out 6 months before the Declaration.
This question about Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which when it originally came out was anonymous, by the way. That pamphlet was immensely influential. Indeed, the two things in the spring of 1776 that gave rise to the Declaration. Because remember, before that, they were like stuck in debate. Dickinson and John Adams, no movement, nothing's going on. But two things in the spring of 1776. One, I've already told you the story. Washington comes with intelligence. He's got the proof, right? They're hiring Hessians. But the other one was Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It's the first vocal, full-throated call for independence. Before that, everyone was talking about these rights and all these, but he actually goes the next step. Calls for independence. The king is a brute.
So that influence on the
So the influence on the legislature is massive, and they all write about it. Specific influence in the document is not necessarily the case, because by that time, the key arguments that Jefferson pulls together, they're already out there. They're in the air. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. Here's an interesting factoid. Again, I'm not downplaying Jefferson. Jefferson is extremely important, and he's a beautiful writer. I mean, it's just amazing some of those lines he comes up with. But we're wrong when we think that Jefferson had, what did Jefferson think, therefore he just wrote what Jefferson thought. That's not the case. He's capturing these ideas. We often talk about how America is influenced by John Locke and Algernon Sidney, which is true and very important. But here's an interesting fact, which I didn't know until I kind of started working on these things here. The most references to John Locke are found in a certain type of writing that was extremely influential prior to the American Revolution. Sermons. Which meant they were making arguments about John Locke and consent and rights and all this kind of, right next to making arguments about the Bible and, right? It's fascinating. Which is to say that it's not what did Jefferson think about John Locke or what did John Locke think. Those are interesting questions, don't get me wrong. The question here is what do the Americans at the time think about those ideas. And so it's just overwhelming when you read their letters, right? They're clearly influenced by classical education. They're classically educated themselves. You study Latin in school, and if you study Latin in school, you read Cicero. Most of them studied Greek in school, and if you study Greek in school, you read the Bible and Homer and other things. But I mean, but the Bible and Cicero were the two clearest Greek and Latin writings. The influence of the common law coming out of England and that whole tradition is massive. The common law itself shaped a lot because of Coke, or Cook, I guess pronounced correctly, is largely shaped by the Christian tradition through into the law. And then, of course, the Christian tradition itself. I mean, there's a lot of that, and we kind of ignore it when we think of, well, what did Jefferson think? He just wrote what he thought.
So Jefferson's not so much bringing John Locke's thoughts as much as he's...
John Locke was in the air. He was everywhere. He was everywhere. But it was a John Locke that they understood to be perfectly consistent with the Christian tradition that was also all around them. what we need to understand is what were they thinking? And when you look at it that way, you read the Declaration. It's the stories. First of all, I think it's more interesting, to be perfectly honest. But it's more honest to them. Right? If you're going to teach history, right, your number one obligation in teaching history is to teach history fairly, which means you teach it not your interpretation as much as what did that person think, and you teach it warts and all. And it turns out that when you teach it that way, the story is actually usually a lot better. It's a lot more interesting, but also it allows you to see something you might not see otherwise. Today there's a lot of critics on the left and the right, to be perfectly honest, about the American founding. They owned slaves. It's all about property and all this kind of thing. But just go back and what did they actually say of it? They grapple with these questions too. Right? The interesting about those things is not what they did specifically. Those are important, but they're imperfect. They're not political philosophers. They're not right. They're practical, and they're doing very practical things. What's amazing is what they're aspiring to. That's hard. It's hard.
In the very front row here.
Since you've started talking about John Locke so much, it brought me to just asking, I haven't studied enough of the time and the sermons and everything else. Did the sermons or the time kind of change life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and happiness? Or is that just kind of a fusion between Locke and Aristotle's Polus or something? I always wondered why did he change it?
So John Locke's famous formulation is life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and state, as he called it. But by that he meant this broad term, property. That phrase is used at least once and is around. It's used by the Continental Congress once. So it was there, but the Declaration always used the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that was never questioned. It was never brought up in amendment or debate, and everyone just kept it there. Which is to say they agreed. There was no argument about that. But anyway, going back to these traditions, these longer traditions, they're all really educated, as is the general public. The general public was well read. It boggles my mind to conclude that they did not understand the meaning of happiness, which is to say that happiness in Greek, all of Greek writing, all of the Roman tradition, and in the biblical tradition, the Christian tradition broadly, happiness is the word that is used as the end of man in his life. True and substantive happiness. And so the notion that somehow they didn't know that when they changed the word property to happiness is mind-boggling. Of course they knew that. Which is to say they chose not to use a specifically Lockean formulation. Even though they were very much influenced by Locke and consent and all this is very important. But in that crucial moment, they chose not to use that formulation. They used a much larger formulation, which is the pursuit of happiness. And notice how you don't have a right to happiness. They also added another word. You have a right to pursue happiness. Right? Government does not determine and cannot guarantee happiness. But you, because you're a human, because what man does is life, he naturally has liberty. And what does he do? He naturally pursues his own good. And his own good, through human excellence, points towards this substantive happiness. So there's a formula. There's a formulation there that I think it's clearly in their letters, and they talk about it, that has substantive meaning. Today we read these things very quickly. Life, liberty. That meant life, liberty, and more liberty. It's just whatever your happiness, whatever makes you happy. But that just goes against the whole history of all of Western thought back to the very beginning. It's not determinative. It doesn't mean that it's kind of, but it does have substantive meaning, which is why I emphasize here. See, what is this world of the founders, right? man can grasp truth. Man has a mind, is metaphysically capable of understanding truth. You notice how everyone walked in here and they just assumed that I was a human being and I was going to speak and you could be able to understand it. You didn't assume I'm a dolphin or whatever, right? There's a certain humanness about grasping the truth of things. And then the notion that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's the theology of the Declaration, which is not specifically Christian, but it's not empty. There's something there. What are they doing? They're looking for. They're in a world that's kind of somewhat of a pre-modern world, but they're also looking for some way to be flourishing, to create a society of flourishing human beings, but not have things which would prevent that flourishing and cause us to kill each other. For instance, most prominently, example being the English Civil Wars, right? Wars over religion and religious persecution, which is why religious liberty is the most important thing behind all these arguments.
Over here in the fourth row.
Yes, Dr. Spalding. I'm okay. Just from a legal perspective, to try to understand this. So you have like 3.5 million people, I remember, living in these disparate colonies, all created by charters that aren't very identical. And when you try to go back to those charters and figure out what the rights are, it's not very clear what rights we did have. So is that the fundamental legal problem? When we try to write a Declaration of Independence, we can't go back and cite the charter, we got this right.
Yeah.
And so we have to go and create.
Right.
And is that the whole process you're describing? You have to go above and beyond the legal structure.
I will, to some extent, yes. But let me add to that a little bit more, because the Declaration is a legal document, and since it was passed by a Continental Congress, it is actually an organic document of the United States. So it actually is a document, pre-constitutional document of standing. But having said that, we have to recognize it is it is kind of outside of the constitutional system. It's a revolution, since it's a revolutionary document. But they've got two problems. One is, in general, that what they're trying to preserve are the rights of Englishmen originally, which is, say, the liberties traditionally recognized and upheld over the long tradition of English constitutionalism as it developed. That's very clear. But you have two problems. One is there's this thing called the Glorious Revolution in England, in which power shifted from the king to Parliament. The Americans thought that was actually violating their rights as Englishmen, because it was taking away their consent. It was taxing them without their consent in particular, which is a right that goes back to Magna Carta. But the other problem they had was equally legal and philosophical, but also very practical. If they want to preserve those rights, they can't make an argument in a war with the King of England backed up by the whole English army and navy by claiming merely the rights of Englishmen. Because odds are the final say in that matter is going to be the king and Parliament. So instead, what did they appeal to? They appealed to what was behind the rights of Englishmen, which were the rights of all men. And those rights are grounded in nature, going back to this whole tradition. The challenge then is, how do you then reestablish that over time into a legal system? Which is why you have to connect the Declaration to the Articles of Confederation, and then eventually the US Constitution, which is the formal legal document. But the Declaration plays a key role in going from English constitutionalism to American constitutionalism. Is that right? But yes, it has to do with, ultimately, how do you ground rights and your rights and liberties? How do you ground those? The American colonies, and us by extension, had received a wonderful heritage despite its messiness, despite all the wars between the French and the English and everybody, and the messiness of that whole history, we inherited British constitutionalism, the rule of law. But we did something the British did not do and could not do, because they couldn't get rid of their king. Is that we established the rule of law under a constitution, a written document of law. But you can't do that unless you first establish who is the sovereign. And the sovereign is what the Declaration is about. We are the sovereign because we possess rights, because we are all created equal. So that's the term. It sets up the whole legal argument to follow.
I believe we have time for one more question. In the third row over here.
I think you can hear me. Thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
To ensure our love of this. Joseph Ellis just wrote a great book about the arguments on slavery and deals with that clause about happiness as opposed to the idea of the pursuit of property. Instead, because, and he presents the debate about the slavery issue, not to disparage the founding of this country, but to enhance the founding of this country and this beautiful humanism and the tensions that our founding fathers had over the issue of slavery and the all created equal, and he presents this, and I'd like to have your comment about that. The Declaration is as you mentioned already, the ideal aspiration, as opposed to the Constitution, 3/5 of a person, all the details involved there, which is the beauty of America, this difference between the reality of the Constitution and the ideal of the Declaration. And that's what makes this country so great, is we have this tension between reality and aspiration, ideal.
Gosh, that's we have about an hour or two. I can teach a whole course or class on that. I write about the slavery question a lot. It's the question in many ways. It's the primary question. It's a absolutely barbaric practice occurring in a country that says that all men are created equal. Now, of course, just to jump ahead, right? This is Lincoln's birthday, right? If you want to know about the question about slavery in America, you got to read Lincoln. Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Having said that, I would tweak what you said just slightly in this sense. It's not that the Declaration is our aspirations and the Constitution is reality, right? It's that the Constitution is informed by the principles of the Declaration. One of the grievances, there was a grievance in the Declaration that condemned the king for the slave trade. This, despite the fact that Continental Congress, oftentimes overlooked, 2 weeks prior had already condemned the slave trade in America. That clause was dropped, among other things, because 2 colonies would not agree to it, but also because it was probably the worst and literally the poorest written grievance from Jefferson's pen. It was poorly written because it accused the king of introducing slavery in America, this barbaric thing, which was not completely accurate, but it was a condemnation of slavery. But then it turned around and also condemned the king in England for emancipating slaves who fought for the British cause. So it was like mixed messaging. It was really messy. So they dropped out. But what did they do? They kept the statement that all men are created equal. It's amazing about the Declaration of Independence is that a bunch of people, many of whom owned slaves, many did not. Some who owned slaves, like George Washington, freed his slaves, because over time he realized it was a violation of, among other things, the Declaration of Independence. Some did not. What's amazing, though, however, is they agreed to begin a nation by declaring that it's self-evident and true that all men are created equal. That's the dynamite. The Constitution I'll give a brief answer here because this is, it's later in the evening, but I can't pass this up. I mean, the Constitution is full of compromises, but the compromises make no sense unless you understand the Declaration's statement of principle. Right? You mentioned the 3/5 clause. Do you know who introduced the 3/5 clause? An abolitionist. It doesn't say that a black man is 3/5 of a person as if they're less than a person. What it says is they will be counted for, slaves will be counted as 3/5 for purposes of enumeration when it comes to Congress and taxation. What was it? It was a fight with the growing southern states who wanted it one for one to give them more representation in Congress so they could control the nation, and the abolitionists said no. And so they gave them 3/5. That's where it landed. The slave trade is postponed in the Constitution, but it's a full power of the United States Congress, and the first moment they could, under Jefferson's administration, they abolished the slave trade. And then the Fugitive Slave Clause, the third great clause, which says fugitives have to be returned, go back and read it. Go and literally go find it and read it. It is the most circumspectual, odd piece of legalese constitutional I've ever read. Why? Because it bends over backwards to say that slavery is something recognized. It never says the word slavery, it's always the word person, right? This thing is something in the laws of particular states, in laws thereof, and it's just like, right, it's not recognized in the Constitution. It's actually quite interesting how they do it. Which, yes, they're compromises, but clearly they're compromises to get the thing done, but they're not statements of principle. What's the statement of principle? Declaration of Independence. So the way I teach the slavery questions, you teach it up front, clearly, warts and all. Jefferson was hypocritical. He never freed his slaves because he liked to drink French wine and wasted his money and couldn't afford to do it. This is true, right? But he knew that slavery was wrong. He writes clearly, he knows it's wrong. Washington knew it was wrong too. And he figured out how to do it, right? And not only did he free his slaves, it was in his will, but most of his slaves were owned by his wife, Martha, and he couldn't touch those because they were dowry slaves. But the slaves, they were his, he freed them. And in his will, he provided money to care for them. Anyone, they teach them to read, any of them was sick or ill, he would pay for their life until, and the last payment out of that, his estate was 1830 something. So he clearly converted on this question. Again, just to, we get stuck on these things because it's such a barbaric practice, and race is such a hot question in our politics today. But the actual history is fascinating, and it's difficult because these are human beings who make mistakes and faults, but they've got to make hard decisions, right? And it's Lincoln's point. You wouldn't have a nation if they didn't do this. But what do they give us? The Declaration.
Join us in falling in love with America again.